Let's talk about The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Since the re-release, I played it, I've been thinking about it, and I was so wrong about this game. Oh my god. I know I'm probably not the first person to make a video with this type of thing, but I think we were too hard on Skyward Sword. There's a lot to say about that though. There's a lot to unpack with just that, because maybe it's just me being thirsty for a new traditional Zelda type experience coming off of Breath of the Wild, which really shook up the formula. So jumping back into a Zelda that's just straightforward, dungeon-based, blah, 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 has been very satisfying. So there's some rose-colored glasses there, I guess. But Skyward Sword is a really interesting conversation, even removed from the HD remaster, so to speak. Because I do understand a lot of people have issues with the $60 price tag with this, and Nintendo in general, they're expensive. Their stuff never goes on sale. It drives me nuts. So I understand some of the issues with this. I'll talk about some of the conveniences this brings, but mostly I just want to actually focus on the core game, which you can just go back and play on Wii or whatever. I'm actually just revisiting the whole game itself, and it's way better than I remember. I've been making YouTube videos for like 10 years now, and I never went on record about Skyward Sword, I don't think. I think Skyward Sword released like just before I was really reviewing games hardcore, and I bounced off of it hard. Something about it just didn't click with me. Maybe it was the motion controls, maybe it was just Link on a bird that just didn't really appeal to me at first, but now, coming back, I'm all about it. And before moving forward, I also just want to highlight people who have been backing me on YouTube memberships with the join button or on Patreon. I've kind of quietly launched that. A lot of people have asked how they could support my videos. So I've given you the option to back me, get early access to some of my videos, a couple little behind the scenes updates here and there. All of my content is still going to be out there and free for everybody. I'm not paywalling anything, but if you've chosen to support me, thanks a lot. It's very much appreciated. Now, Skyward Sword for me is successful, or at least it clicked with me now in 2021 as a more wizened person. I don't know, I'm not. I'm actually probably dumber than I was as my brain slowly rots. Still, Zelda is interesting here for a couple of things. First and foremost, character moments. Now, every Zelda game handles characters, voice, presentation, how much you can really empathize or just get attached to characters in different ways, and Skyward Sword handles it really, really well, specifically with really selling a connection between Link and Zelda. Feels a little old school, at least for the setup of it. You know, it's very romanticized, not in the way of romance, but the other way, and it really works. You really get a connection, and for me, it's up there with the Zelda games where it feels like you're actually legitimately trying to pursue someone and save someone, and there's something behind it. And behind it, like, they don't give you too much, but it's just the expressions on the characters, the musical themes for each characters, the emotions, the way they're animated, the way they look at each other, it just really, really hits. And that really goes for the whole supporting cast, because you meet a lot of interesting side characters along the way, like, you know, like some almost essentially mythical gods that are all kind of creative and weird, kind of for perspective. Dungeons or quenching your flame or wherever you are on the map, but also just the main town characters like Groose. If you've never played this, you've probably heard a lot about Groose, who they do some really cool things with, who also has a really good score behind him. But someone who starts out like a Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, kind of like that asshole douchebag character, and then kind of develops into something else. They try and do something with it, and it's very compelling to see. It's only here and there sprinkled throughout the game, but it's really special. And with that, I keep saying the musical cues and stuff, but the music is awesome. I think every Zelda game, really, for me, is just half of it is the music and the score. But here, there's just some really memorable stuff and just an excellent composition. This is the first Zelda game to use a full orchestra for the track, and it really makes a hell of a difference. Where the game, with its color palette and its style and its honestly limited graphical capabilities, it can feel small or just kind of simple, but the music really, really freaking elevates it to the next territory and really pushes it into like that, like that like Zelda, you know? I actually remember when this first released, I believe there was like a special edition version of the game where you could get a soundtrack CD that had all of these anniversary Zelda tunes all recorded with an orchestra. That's incredible. I actually still listen to it. I have like the files I ripped from the CD. I was actually one of the last people to use CDs. I hung on to the bitter end, but RIP that, I guess. I strongly believe sometimes music really sells things. I've talked about this before, even with movies and stuff. I think sometimes like an okay movie can be elevated by just excellent music that like gets you. And Zelda also is very much strengthened by that. I'm not saying Zelda is bad and the music bolsters it, but for me, again, music is half of the experience. Then the other thing, of course, is just the main gameplay loop. It's a pretty well put together Zelda game. The whole Skyloft thing, flying around on the bird is whatever, but the concept of the floating city above the clouds with the mystery world underneath is very cool in terms of just like exploration and adventure. It really gives you a Link going out into the great unknown, which is always really cool and satisfying. But also just the fact that the way it's all structured around the town. You venture out, you come back to Skyloft. You venture out, you get stuff, you collect stuff that'll help you out. You come back to Skyloft, find a way to unlock to a new area, maybe get some sub-objectives here and there. There's a lot of hidden things throughout Skyloft that keep opening up throughout your play that make it one of the more satisfying hub towns in Zelda because it's so intertwined with the actual gameplay. There's just like a little added meaningfulness to collecting certain things and bringing things back to the shop, having your shield repaired, a better shield, buying items. So the loop slash economy is pretty evolved for a Zelda game, at least at this time when this first released. This was pretty, a lot of new stuff for a Zelda game. Now this stuff is like in every game, you take it for granted, but the way they integrated it here is kind of like a natural evolution or expansion of how the old Zelda games would work, where you just get rupees and then you'd go to a store and buy something. Like they blew it out a little bit in a way that really works and ties really well into the whole bouncing back and forth between the areas, the biomes, and Skyloft. And of course, traditional dungeons. This game gives you a lot of dungeons, and there's parts in these dungeons that are like those older Zelda games where you get stuck sometimes, or you figure it out and you go, oh shit, like wow, that took me a while to figure out. That was obvious, but I didn't think of it. Or, you know, like there's certain things with Zelda dungeons where it's a lot of stuff that is usually obvious, and then every once in a while you hit a complete roadblock. And then by the time you do figure it out, you're like, oh, yeah, I should have figured that out. But it's like a good balance of actual cleverness, so you don't feel like you're just dumb or you're frustrated or anything like that. Of course, it has the pacing of the gadgets and everything. You know, you get a new thing that makes things easier, then you can go back to old areas and get new stuff, but there's more of it. They really blew it out, especially in the biomes, because there's not only dungeons, but there's distinct biomes before those dungeons that you can mess around in, which again adds to the satisfaction, and then you're going back and also upgrading your sword. As the game goes on, there's a lot to it, and it does reuse places, but the way it puts new spins on them works, I think, for pacing the best it can. It may not be perfectly paced, but it is still completely satisfying to play from that go to dungeons, do things type of thing. And it feels very long. Replaying this, I was like, man, this game feels way longer than I remembered. The only thing, though, that still doesn't really hold up for me is the combat. I don't know. This is all really, really a matter of personal preference and personal taste, but the controls still drive me nuts. It doesn't matter if it's motion controlled with the Wii Nunchuck or a Joy-Con, or the newer version that makes it a little bit more convenient and you can do it directionally with a stick. It is better, and I bounce back and forth, but I played mostly with the actual new traditional scheme, but it's still not perfect, and you still just feel like you're not always completely in control like you usually are in a Zelda game. And every once in a while, it just annoyed me, and I think it doesn't look great. It doesn't always feel too satisfying, except for boss battles, which I'll get to in a second. Just moment-to-moment combat, not super into it, but it's also not like offensively bad. It's just like you get through it as something that you do. And I think it shows how strong the rest of the game is, that I am kind of bothered by one of the main things, the combat. Not super into it, coupled with the camera, which, you know, it has two different ways in the new version to control it, but either way, it's finicky and frustrating sometimes. But even despite that, like I still played through it and I still loved it top to bottom. And I was actually really impressed by that. It's not often that like a main loop or like a control scheme of a game bothered me. And I ended up still completely loving the game. I give Skyward Sword props for that. And you know, some people are really loving the updated motion controls or the new controls. Again, I just couldn't really find a sweet spot with either of them. Still, if we are talking about the upgraded version for a second, though, the 60 FPS is very nice. But yeah, that's the other thing. I really should have talked about that before with the dungeons and stuff. But there's some good boss battles, and I think that's where some of the combat gameplay shines a little more because it gives you a little bit more to do. It demands more of you, and it can still be frustrating, but it's got that added level of figuring it out to the combat that I really like. Just in terms of like if you're fighting a powerful skeleton with 4 arms or a shielded thing, or one of my favorite boss battles is the multi-armed thing at the end of the ancient cistern dungeon. That stuff is really creative, and it feels like the developers were just like on like such a creative high with coming up with some of these concepts that I think some of these boss battles rival some of the more like old school Zelda boss battles, you know, like from Link's Awakening. Like they feel like that, but like with an added layer of cleverness on them that I really like. And with everything, it was just a really good experience for where the story goes, where the Zelda lore goes, and everything. You know, when I first looked at Skyward Sword, I thought it was like a gimmick-riddled game. Motion controls, Link on a bird, your sword, the Master Sword as a character, like, ugh, what are we doing? I was already kind of over the wolf thing by the end of Twilight Princess, but now, playing through it again, none of it feels gimmicky. It all feels pretty meaningful and organic, and it's just a good-ass game to experience. And that's why I think I was really wrong about it, because I always looked back at Skyward Sword as kind of like the black sheep, where it's like all the Zelda games are here, or all the mainline console Zelda games are here, and then Skyward Sword was like here, and not in the same classroom, maybe in like the classroom, you know, next door, the next class over. But now, like, while I still won't rank it as like the top Zelda game for me personally, I'm very much like, oh no, you belong in this classroom. Come on in here. You know, that's my crappy metaphor. I don't know. Zelda goes to school. But I kind of wanted to share this and present it in this way because I think there's a lot of hubbub about the price and what Nintendo is doing and how some people think it's like not a good enough remaster to justify $60. I will say whatever, regardless of that, if you go dig up a Wii U or a Wii and play this thing, whatever, the actual game itself, I was wrong about it. I think it's really worth experiencing if you never have before. It's a nice palate cleanser after Breath of the Wild and before Breath of the Wild 2 with some seemingly interesting lore stuff going on that I'd love to make a whole video about. But yeah, so this is also a conversation, so I want to hear what you guys think about Skyward Sword, especially if you're like me where you weren't into it and you revisited it. Do you feel the same? Do you feel better? Is this your first time playing it? Because I'd also like to hear that perspective, kind of removed from the old discourse from years ago. You know, it's like a totally different experience for new people. So let's talk. Again, thank you for those of you who support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships. Very happy to have you, and very happy to have all of you guys here watching me, just talking about stuff I love. If you appreciate this, clicking the like button helps me out legitimately. Thank you. But I'm Jake Baldino. Thanks for watching. Subscribe because video games. Pizza's on me.